I never thought I'd be sitting here, staring at photos of my wife at a swinger party where my world crumbled. She will regret this. I'll make her beg for mercy. I'll make her feel all of my pain, in every sense of the word. Oh, she has no idea what's coming. I'll repay her in kind, over and over again, until she's as exhausted and broken, both mentally and physically. But let me start from the beginning. From the outside looking in, my life with Emily seemed perfect. We had everything people envy. A beautiful house on a quiet suburban street, stable careers, and a marriage that looked effortless. Neighbors would smile and wave as we walked our dog in the evenings, and friends would joke about how we were relationship goals. I played my role well. We both did. But if you asked me to describe the moment it all started to feel off, I'm not sure I could pinpoint it exactly. Maybe it was the way Emily's laughter began to sound forced, or how her eyes, once so full of warmth when they met mine, started flickering with something distant, like her mind was somewhere else. At first, I told myself it was stress. Her job as an interior designer had always been demanding. She was juggling multiple high-profile clients, and I knew how much she hated leaving projects unfinished. I wanted to believe it was just that work fatigue. But then there were the little changes. Emily had always been punctual. She liked routine, cherished it even. So when her late nights at work became a pattern, I noticed. It wasn't just late nights, though. She'd come home tired, her face flushed, offering quick excuses that didn't quite add up. The client meeting ran over. One of the girls needed a drink after work. I nodded and smiled, but something about her tone gnawed at me. Then there was her phone. She'd always left it lying around, but now it seemed glued to her hand. Whenever a notification popped up, she'd glance at it quickly, then tilt the screen away, as if hiding something. I joked about it one evening. "Who are you texting so much?" And she laughed it off, claiming it was a group chat. Maybe I could have let that go if it weren't for the lingerie. Emily had started wearing new pieces, beautiful, delicate sets I'd never seen before. But these weren't for me. I first noticed when she slipped into bed one night wearing a stunning lace bra, and I reached for her, thinking it was for me. She pulled away gently, saying she was tired. The next morning, as she dressed for work, she wore it under her blouse. I'd never been a jealous man, but there was something deeply unsettling about that moment. I told myself I was overthinking it, that these were minor things, the natural ebb and flow of marriage. But there was this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. A quiet voice whispering that the life we'd built wasn't as perfect as it seemed. It was the kind of suspicion that creeps in slowly, like smoke through a crack in the wall. You smell it before you see it, before you understand that something, somewhere, is burning. I just didn't know what it was yet. It was the smell that first made me stop and think. Smoke. Emily hated cigarettes. She'd always complained if we passed someone smoking on the street or walked into a place where the scent lingered. So when she came home one evening, her clothes carrying that unmistakable odor, it struck me as odd. I didn't say anything right away. She breezed through the door, poured herself a glass of wine, and gave me a tired smile, muttering something about being at Lisa's and how a couple of the girls had been smoking outside. It was plausible, I told myself. But as she walked past me, the faint but persistent scent clung to her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. That was the first crack in my certainty. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, other changes began to surface, small things I might not have noticed if I wasn't already uneasy. Her phone, for example. Emily used to leave it lying around, on the counter, the nightstand, the armrest of the couch. Now, it was always in her hand or tucked away in her bag. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it, press a button to silence the notification, and move on, as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just her phone. Emily seemed distracted in general. Her mind was somewhere else. At dinner, she'd nod at what I said, but I could tell she wasn't really listening. Her laughter was different too, quick, shallow, like she was just going through the motions. And then there was the lingerie. I noticed it one evening as she was getting dressed to go out. A new set, lace, black, elegant. She wasn't wearing it for me, though. I could tell by the way she paired it with a plain blouse and slacks. It wasn't for a romantic evening at home. It was for someone else, or at least somewhere else. Emily never used to wear things like that on ordinary days. Those pieces had always been reserved for us, for special moments. Now they appeared randomly, without explanation, and she didn't seem to think I'd notice, or maybe she didn't care if I did. I tried to reason with myself, to explain it all away. The smoke? Coincidence. The phone? Everyone's more attached to their devices these days. The lingerie? Maybe she just wanted to feel confident at work. But deep down, I knew better. These weren't isolated incidents. They were pieces of a puzzle I was beginning to put together. Each new observation felt like another step closer to a truth I wasn't ready to confront. There was something in the way she moved now, in the way she avoided my eyes for just a second too long. The life we had built together, the life I had thought was unshakable, was beginning to feel fragile. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overthinking, but I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach, the creeping suspicion that something was happening behind the scenes of our perfect life. And I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what it was. The night I followed her, I told myself it was just to ease my mind. Emily had mentioned a book club meeting. One of those vague excuses that had started to pile up lately. She'd been evasive, her tone too casual, her words rehearsed. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being lied to. When she left the house that evening, I waited 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. My heart was pounding as I kept my distance, following her car through the winding suburban streets. The closer we got to the outskirts of town, the more uneasy I felt. She wasn't heading to a library or someone's house. She was heading somewhere else entirely. Finally, she turned down a secluded road lined with large, upscale homes. Their driveways were filled with expensive cars, and the soft glow of chandeliers spilled out through curtained windows. I parked my car a block away and watched as Emily pulled into the driveway of one of the houses. She stepped out of the car, adjusting her coat and glancing around before walking toward the front door. I couldn't see much, but I noticed her hesitance. She paused on the steps, checking her phone before finally ringing the doorbell. A tall man opened the door, greeting her with a familiarity that set my blood boiling. She smiled, stepping inside as the door closed behind her. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel. What was she doing? Who was that man? A dozen possibilities raced through my mind, none of them good. When she returned home later that night, her demeanor was different, lighter, almost carefree. She greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek, saying the book club had gone well, and headed straight to the shower. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, while she was in the garden, I took her phone. She'd started locking it recently, but I knew her passcode, something she probably assumed I wouldn't bother to use. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through her messages, her photos, her emails, and then I found it. A thread of messages in a group chat titled, The Circle. Explicit messages. Graphic descriptions of events. Photos of unfamiliar faces. And at the center of it all was Emily. My stomach churned as I read the exchanges. Plans for private swingers parties. Discussions of who would be attending. Even rules about discretion. It was all there. There was no mistaking it. She had been attending these parties for weeks, maybe months, meeting strangers and engaging in things I couldn't bring myself to fully comprehend. I stared at the phone, my breath heavy, my chest tight. Everything I thought I knew about Emily, about us, was unraveling before my eyes. When she came back inside, she smiled at me, oblivious to what I had just uncovered. The perfect facade had shattered, and now all that remained was the truth. The more I learned, the less I recognized the woman I thought I knew. After finding the messages, I couldn't stop myself. I had to know everything. I needed to understand how far this betrayal went and what kind of world Emily had stepped into without me. The group chat led me to a private website, a sleek, password-protected portal for an exclusive circle of people who called themselves The Circle. From the surface, it looked like any other social networking site, but the content beneath was anything but ordinary. With Emily's credentials saved in her phone, I logged in, my heart pounding as the homepage loaded. What I found was a carefully curated world of decadence. It wasn't just a party, it was a lifestyle. The site detailed strict rules about secrecy, discretion, and participation. Members paid steep fees for access to lavish events hosted in private mansions. Everything was planned to perfection. Gourmet catering, high-end security, and an anything-goes atmosphere where boundaries were pushed and pleasures indulged. The pictures and videos on the site were worse than anything I had imagined. Couples and strangers intertwined in dimly lit rooms, their faces blurred but their bodies unmistakable. It wasn't just the acts themselves that sickened me. It was the sheer casualness of it all. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the sense of camaraderie. And then I found her. Emily. My Emily. She was in several of the photos, smiling and laughing as though she didn't have a care in the world. In one image, she was holding a glass of champagne, her hand resting on the arm of a man I didn't recognize. In another, she was seated on a plush sofa, her body pressed against someone else's, their faces close enough to kiss. The messages accompanying the photos were even worse. Explicit details of her encounters, shared among the group as though they were discussing a casual dinner party. Her name came up more than once, always with a tone of approval, as though she had impressed them with her enthusiasm. I couldn't look away, even as my stomach churned and my hands shook with rage. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way she had so seamlessly compartmentalized this life from the one we shared. I closed the laptop and sat there in silence, my mind racing. Every late-night meeting, every vague excuse, every time she had come home smelling of smoke or wearing that new lingerie, it all clicked into place. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was deliberate, calculated. She had chosen this life, chosen these strangers, chosen to keep me in the dark. And yet, even as the anger boiled inside me, another emotion clawed its way to the surface. Humiliation. This wasn't just her betrayal, it was mine too. The man I had been, the marriage I thought we had, the trust one had so willingly given. All of it had been a lie. I thought I had known pain before, but nothing could have prepared me for this. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to collect myself, to let the storm of anger and humiliation settle enough so I could think clearly. Exploding in the moment wouldn't be enough. She needed to feel the full weight of what she'd done, to understand that this wasn't something she could sweep under the rug with pretty words and empty promises. The opportunity came a few nights later. Emily was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while I paced silently in the kitchen. I watched her from a distance, noting the small smile on her lips, the ease with which she carried herself. The carefree attitude was like a dagger in my chest. She had no idea what I knew. When I finally spoke, my voice was cold and steady. How was the last book club meeting? She glanced up, startled by the sudden question. It was fine, she said, her tone light but guarded. Why? I stepped closer, holding her gaze. You've been busy lately, working late, spending time with Lisa. Those meetings. It must be exhausting. She frowned, her phone lowering slightly. David, what's this about? I didn't answer. Instead, I placed my phone on the coffee table and opened the photos I had saved, the messages, the images from the site, everything. I slid it toward her without a word. The color drained from her face the moment she saw it. Her hand trembled as she picked up the phone, scrolling through the evidence I'd gathered. David, don't. I interrupted, my voice sharp. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what this is. Tears welled in her eyes as she set the phone down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It's not what you think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's exactly what I think, I snapped. You've been lying to me, sneaking around, throwing away everything we've built for this. She broke then, the tears spilling over as she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she choked out. I never meant to hurt you. I just what? I demanded, my voice rising. Needed to experiment? Needed to feel alive? Needed to betray me in the most humiliating way possible. Her sobs deepened, her words tumbling out between gasps for air. I felt trapped. Okay? Our life, it became so predictable, so routine. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought maybe if I explored, I'd find a way to feel better, to bring something back to us. Her words hit me like a blow to the chest. Trapped? Was that how she saw our marriage? The life I thought we'd both cherished? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Bring something back to us? You mean bring them back to us? The men, the parties, the lies? What exactly were you planning to bring back? She reached for me, but I stepped away, her touch suddenly unbearable. I still love you, she whispered desperately. Ido. I made a mistake, but I never stopped loving you. Please, David, please don't give up on us. Her words hung in the air, but they felt hollow, meaningless. How could she say she loved me while doing this? How could she destroy the foundation of our life together and expect me to believe anything she said? I wanted to scream, to rage, to throw something just to release the fire building in my chest. But instead, I stood there, numb, as the weight of it all pressed down on me. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built my life with had become a stranger. And I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her, or if I even wanted to. The days after the confrontation were a blur of silence and tears. Emily was desperate, her guilt and fear dripping from every word she said. She hovered around me constantly, trying to break through the wall I had built between us. David, please, she would whisper, her voice raw from crying. I know I hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just don't give up on us. Her words were laced with panic, her eyes pleading for some sign that I was listening. But I wasn't sure I could hear her anymore. She would cry herself to sleep at night, clutching my hand, but I didn't hold hers back. In the mornings, she'd try to talk, to explain herself again, as though repetition might soften the blow. I was stupid, David, she admitted one night, her voice trembling. I thought I could separate it from us, that it didn't mean anything. But it was a lie and I was wrong. I know I was wrong. It was almost pathetic, her begging, her promises, her apologies. But the part that struck me most wasn't her guilt. It was her fear. She wasn't just afraid of losing me. She was terrified of losing the life we'd built. And that fear gave me pause. I thought about leaving her. I thought about it a lot. Packing a bag, walking out, and never looking back. But it wasn't that simple. In our state, no-fault divorce laws made everything messy. It didn't matter what she'd done, how she'd betrayed me, or how much she had destroyed my trust. Legally, none of it mattered. If I left, I would lose everything. The house, the savings, even part of my income. Emily could file for spousal support, and the court would likely side with her. My entire life could be turned upside down, and the thought of starting over with nothing filled me with a different kind of rage. It wasn't just about the money, though. Divorce would make her the victim in everyone else's eyes. She would play the role of the devastated wife, and I would be the cold, unyielding husband who couldn't forgive her mistakes. No, that wasn't an option. I decided to stay, not because I wanted to forgive her, and certainly not because I believed her words about love and redemption. I stayed because it gave me control. If she thought she could keep me trapped in this marriage, then I would make her regret every moment of it. She wanted to make amends? Fine. She wanted to earn my forgiveness? Let her try. But I wasn't going to make it easy. I would take back the power she had stolen from me. For now, I let her believe there was hope. I let her cry and beg and promise to change, pretending that I might one day forgive her. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about revenge. Emily sat across from me, her eyes red and swollen, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and suffocating, while she waited for me to speak. She wanted answers, needed them, but I wasn't in a rush to give her what she wanted. I've been thinking, I said finally, my voice cold and measured, about us, about what you've done. She flinched, her lips pressing into a tight line, but she nodded. I'll do anything, David. Anything to make this right. Her desperation was palpable, and I let it hang in the air before continuing. You say you want to make amends. You say you want my trust back. But words mean nothing, Emily. You've proven that. I'll prove it, she said quickly, leaning forward. Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it. I stared at her for a long moment, letting my expression harden. Fine. If you're serious, you'll have to show me. Permanently. She frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. I want you to get a tattoo. My name and our wedding date. Somewhere visible. Something you can't hide. Her mouth fell open slightly, and for a moment, she looked like she might protest. But then she caught herself, her guilt and fear silencing whatever objection she might have had. A tattoo. I nodded. You said you wanted to prove your commitment. Well, this will be a constant reminder, not just to me but to yourself, of the promises you broke and the promises you're making now. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. I could see the conflict playing out in her mind. She hated the idea, but she was too afraid to say no. Okay, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I'll do it. Her agreement filled me with a dark satisfaction, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I kept my expression stern. Good. We'll schedule the appointment this weekend, and I'll be there to make sure it's done right. Emily nodded, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her shame. She probably thought this was the first step toward reconciliation, the first step toward earning my forgiveness. But I knew better. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about control. About making her carry the mark of her betrayal on her body, where she couldn't escape it. I didn't stop to wonder if I had crossed a line. At this point, there were no lines left to cross. The tattoo was just the beginning. Emily thought she had paid the price for her betrayal, but I had no intention of letting her off that easily. If she wanted to stay, she was going to have to earn every second of my tolerance. The rules started small. Simple tasks I framed as a way for her to regain my trust. She was responsible for cooking every meal, keeping the house spotless, and taking care of all errands. At first, she accepted it willingly, desperate to prove her dedication. But I didn't stop there. I drafted a list, a detailed contract of daily responsibilities she was to fulfill. Morning began with her preparing breakfast exactly the way I liked it, followed by cleaning every room in the house while I reviewed her work. Evenings were for foot massages or fetching whatever I needed. I monitored her progress constantly, pointing out every missed spot on the counter or crease in the sheets. Any failure, no matter how small, led to a verbal tirade. Is this how you show your commitment? I say coldly. You can't even handle this, and you expect me to believe you can fix what you've done? Her exhaustion began to show within days. The dark circles under her eyes, the trembling hands as she tried to meet my demands. It was all part of the plan. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions every moment she was awake. And when she cried, I didn't comfort her. I simply reminded her of why she was in this position to begin with. You chose this, I'd say. If you can't handle it, maybe you're not as sorry as you claim to be. The humiliation didn't stay confined to our home. I wanted her shame to extend beyond our walls, to follow her wherever she went. It started subtly. At dinner parties with friends, I'd make offhand remarks disguised as jokes. Emily's been so busy lately, trying to make up for some poor choices, I'd say, smiling thinly as everyone laughed nervously. When people asked about the tattoo on her wrist, I let her answer. Her stammering explanation was always inadequate, and I would step in with a carefully rehearsed line. It's a symbol of her commitment. We had some challenges, and she's working hard to rebuild trust. I watched as the looks of curiosity turned to judgment. The whispers started soon after. Friends began to distance themselves from her, and even her closest confidants became cold and dismissive. I didn't stop there. At a friend's gathering, I made a pointed remark about her book club, ensuring everyone knew it was a cover for something far less innocent. Her face burned red as she tried to laugh it off, but the damage was done. The isolation was deliberate. The more people turned against her, the more she clung to me, the only person who knew her secret and hadn't completely cast her aside. It was cruel. I knew that. But every time I saw her squirm under the weight of her guilt, every time I saw her falter in the face of someone else's judgment, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. She wanted forgiveness, but all she was getting was the cold, unrelenting reality of the choices she had made. The idea came to me in one of my darker moments, and once it took hold, I couldn't let it go. Emily had dragged me into this humiliation, this world of lies and betrayal. Now she was going to confront it on my terms. I brought it up casually one evening, watching her face pale as I mentioned the idea. "I think we need to face this head-on," I said coldly. "You wanted to experiment, to bring something new to our marriage? Fine. Let's go together." Her voice was barely audible. "David, I don't think that's a good idea." I leaned forward, my gaze hard. "You didn't think it was a good idea to tell me what you were doing either. And yet, here we are." She tried to argue, to plead, but I shut her down with the same tone I had perfected over the past weeks. "You said you'd do anything to make this right. Prove it. Show me you're willing to face what you've done." When the night arrived, she was a nervous wreck. I could see it in her trembling hands, the way her eyes darted around the room as we arrived at the upscale house. But I wasn't interested in her comfort. The party was everything I expected: lavish, indulgent, and utterly repulsive. Emily clung to me, her fear palpable as we navigated the crowd. I didn't let her hide in the shadows. Instead, I guided her toward the center of the action, making sure she saw every interaction, every indiscretion. And then I made my move. I spotted a woman at the bar. Elegant, confident, the type who seemed to thrive in this environment. It didn't take much to strike up a conversation, and within moments, I felt Emily's eyes on me, her silent panic growing with every word I exchanged. When I led the woman to one of the more private corners, I didn't bother looking back at Emily. I didn't have to. I knew she was watching. The act itself was calculated, deliberate. Every laugh, every touch was designed to cut Emily to the core. This wasn't about pleasure, it was about power. About making her feel the humiliation she had so casually inflicted on me. When I finally returned to her, she was pale, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Are you ready to leave?" I asked, my tone neutral as though nothing had happened. She nodded silently, following me to the car. The drive home was quiet, the air thick with her shame and my satisfaction. After that night, Emily became a shell of the woman she once was. Her defiance, her attempts to reclaim some semblance of control, had vanished. All that remained was submission. I tightened my grip on her life, setting rules that left no room for rebellion. She was forbidden from socializing without my permission. Her phone was always subject to inspection, and I dictated how she dressed, down to the smallest detail. Her once vibrant wardrobe was replaced with muted tones and modest cuts. I made her get rid of anything I deemed inappropriate, reminding her that she no longer had the right to make those choices for herself. Even her voice became an instrument of control. She wasn't allowed to interrupt me, to raise her tone, or to speak out of turn. Any deviation resulted in sharp reprimands, a reminder that her actions had forfeited her freedom. The toll on her was evident. She moved through the house like a ghost, her shoulders hunched, her eyes constantly darting to me for approval or fear of rejection. She followed my orders without question, but the weight of it all was breaking her. And I let it. This wasn't about rebuilding our marriage anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about making her feel the full magnitude of her betrayal every single day. She had wanted excitement, a taste of something new. Now her life was nothing but structure, submission, and control. And I wasn't done yet. Emily was a shell of her former self. Once confident and vibrant, she now lived in constant fear, exhausted from meeting my endless demands. Every morning, she prepared my breakfast, cleaned the house meticulously, and followed the schedule I dictated. Her voice was soft, hesitant, and devoid of the laughter that once filled our home. She begged for an end to the torment late at night, her tear-streaked face pleading for mercy. "David, please, I'm sorry. I've done everything you wanted. I didn't care." Her suffering was my justice, a daily reminder of her betrayal. Forgiveness was never part of my plan. It wasn't enough to control her. I wanted her publicly humiliated. Using the messages and photos I had saved, I sent an anonymous email to her workplace, framing it as a concerned husband addressing her behavior. The fallout was immediate. Her colleagues and boss saw everything, the explicit photos, the messages, her secret life. By the end of the day, she was fired, her professional reputation in ruins. She came home broken, unable to speak, her eyes hollow. Watching her crumble was a dark satisfaction, the final piece of my revenge falling into place. As I watched Emily silently fold laundry, I realized she was completely defeated. Her career, her dignity, her freedom, everything was gone. But the satisfaction I expected wasn't there. I had destroyed her, but in doing so, I had destroyed myself. She was trapped now just as I had been. And though I told myself justice had been served, all I felt was emptiness.